monkeys. Our guest tonight is the most respected authority on psychedelics and their proper use. And he's written a book on the safe, therapeutic, and sacred uses of certain substances when, if used properly, can have remarkable healing effects. His name is Dr. James Fadiman. He's a psychologist here in the area, and he's written a book called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. So, Dr. Fadiman, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Dr. Fadiman, you've been involved with psychedelics for a very long time. I think your first experience was with Ram Dass in Paris.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, anyway, psychedelics were made illegal in 1966, and you've written this book that talks about how best to use psychedelics for people who are going to use them anyway. So, why did you write this book at this time?
Well, at some point you begin to realize that you know certain things that other people no longer know about, and so the knowledge is beginning to vanish. And the fact that psychedelics are still illegal didn't seem to be a problem, because I asked the U.S. government, how many people have used psychedelics since you made them illegal? Mm-hmm. And the answer was 23 million people in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that figure goes up 400,000 to 600,000 a year. So my feeling was, if you are interested in maximizing safety and maximizing benefit of these remarkable substances, then you better get good information out there. And there wasn't very good information out there.
Right. And I imagine a lot of these, many of these 23 million people have not had optimum experiences.
Well, one would assume that, given the state of the nation.
Yeah. I mean, taking it at rock concerts and so on. So what for you constitutes a safe and sacred set and setting?
Well, one of the things we all learned in the 60s was that these are not medicines. They're barely substances. What they are is something that activates parts of your own mind. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that activation is almost entirely shiftable by the correct set, meaning mental expectations, mm-hmm. and the correct setting, which is literally the atmosphere you take it in. Mm-hmm. And so what we learned is, if you make people comfortable and safe, then they can make the maximum use of these remarkable substances, similarly to the way they've been used in many other cultures over the centuries.
Mm-hmm. And I think before they were made illegal, there was a lot of research done on, let's say, LSD, and some of the research, I think, was pretty remarkable. I mean, alcoholics had recovery rates that are really rather stunning. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, that was one of the sad things about it becoming illegal, because at least in one part of the world, in Saskatchewan, it is no longer experimental. It was a treatment for hardcore alcoholics. Now, hardcore meaning everything else hadn't worked. Mm-hmm. And with, again, an appropriate set and setting, there was about a 50% total remission rate, meaning abstinence. Right. And that was astounding. And it's sad that we've lost that, because we still have a lot of people who could benefit from it.
Right. Now, I think people who have not tried psychedelics will be kind of confounded about how taking a single dose of a psychedelic can have such a transformative effect on people. I think you cite one man who was a hardcore alcoholic, and after one session, he stopped drinking.
Right, and what's fascinating is a documentary crew showed up 40 years later, mm-hmm. and said to him, what's happened since then? And he said, I haven't had a drink in 40 years. And the filmmaker talked about, well, you must have amazing willpower. And then you see on film the man laugh, and he says, no, I didn't have any interest, which meant there was a reorganization of what he thought was important, and that he didn't need whatever drinking gave him or covered or prevented. He simply didn't need it anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's far different from that you've been strengthened so that you can resist the demon of alcohol. Mm-hmm. And that's that shift. And it's that shift that happens. And what makes most sense is to realize that the medical model isn't the correct model. Medical model says you take something, say aspirin, and your body has a change, and then the aspirin goes away and your body goes back to normal. Mm-hmm. You take an antidepressant, you take a diuretic, and it's this model where simply it's physical. And what happens when you take a psychedelic under good circumstances is you take it And by the time it leaves the body, the experience has not yet come to a peak. So we're already dealing with something other than the psychedelic. And the end of that experience is not experience, and you go back to normal, it's learning. And what people do is they learn something about themselves, about the universe, about their own relationships, and obviously learning lasts a long, long, long time.
How long does it take for LSD, let's say, to wear off? Is it about an hour and a half?
LSD leaves the body in about an hour and a half. An LSD experience is 8 to 12 hours.
So something has been activated.
So something within the body has been activated, and that activation remains and diminishes, as I say, over that amount of time. So it's a long, long experience.
You've made an analogy of taking psychedelic as composting. You compost, how, I can't remember exactly what you said.
Well, what happens when you're using it therapeutically, which is one of the ways,
It composts your experience?
Exactly. It takes your old experiences that you're no longer using, and rather than keep them around kind of on the shelves and bothering you, is it literally allows you to create new experiences out of what you see were the problems in the old experience. Remember, compost, remember the prior word to compost is called garbage.
Yes.
And so, unlike the computer world, garbage in, garbage out, the natural world is garbage out, compost in, new growth. And that's the model that makes more sense.
I think Terence McKenna has another way of explaining it. He says that some psychedelics clear the hard drive that culture has given you, allowing you to be conditioned in a certain way. So it kind of clears that so that you can look at the world slightly differently.
Well, Aldous Huxley called it as if you were seeing the world on the first day of creation.
Right.
So there's a freshness to experience, and that includes a freshness to your own life. And what you realize is that your identity prior to the psychedelic experience was somewhat limited. And what you now have learned is that you are more than that. And to the extent that you're more than that, your problems are a smaller part of you. And in a sense, they become less interesting. Like the alcoholic. He didn't have to deal with the issues around drinking because he was now a person who didn't drink.
How would mainstream psychiatrists react to what we've just been saying?
Well, 40 years ago, when LSD became illegal, they reacted in kind of fear and horror because it made no sense to them, especially in a psychoanalytic theory. But now what I find when I talk to psychiatrists, they, off stage, they tell me about their own psychedelic experiences when they were in medical school or when they were taking organic chemistry. So most people in the mental health professions have a certain amount of experience with altered states in general. Or they went to a bunch of concerts with everyone else and took psychedelics in a very low dose in a not great setting, but in a relatively harmless way. So they're not frightened by the idea that reality is a lot more flexible than we were taught.
Right. Now you're one of the founders of ITP, Institute for Transpersonal Psychology.
Right.
Along with Stan Groff.
Along with Robert Frazier. Stan Groff has another set of organizations.
Okay. All right. Stan Groff once said that there's no scientific evidence that consciousness is produced by the brain. How do you feel about that?
I can't say I worry about it much because wherever it comes from, we have some, and at some point my brain stops working and there doesn't seem to be more consciousness, or at least inside the body. And so I don't worry about it. I love the notion that we're actually like a big radio set and that consciousness is kind of coming from all sides and you pick up your channel. But there's no more evidence of that than the other.
What about Aldous Huxley's idea that the brain is a reducing valve and that actually originally we were connected with something omniscient and that it takes something like a mystical experience or a psychedelic drug or maybe prolonged meditation to remove the lid off of the reducing valve so that you can realize what we actually are, but are prevented from seeing?
Well, that feels much more like the explanation that makes sense when you talk to people. Because what people say is that reality, it turns out to have a wider spectrum. It's like, we see visible light, but that doesn't mean that ultraviolet and infrared don't exist. It's just that we can't see them. And however, with instruments, we can see them.
Right.
And so consciousness also is a limited amount of the consciousness spectrum. And when you have a psychedelic, it allows more of what is actually present but invisible to be seen, felt, and experienced. And that is all the way from things flicker a little bit, which means the way your eye moves, it actually is in motion, but we continually kind of make it not look like it's in motion.
Right.
But really, we're seeing the world this way all the time. And that's minimal. To maximum is what's called a mystical experience, where you begin to see the connection of everything with everything. And that's the kind of maximum opening of the valve.
Now, as a founder of ITP, Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, you wanted to kind of focus on extraordinary experiences, and you compared the human mind to maybe a bell curve, where on one side of it there are people who are crazy, kind of dysfunctional, and then the other side of it, there are people, how can we put them, not necessarily more intelligent, but maybe visionary.
Well, they're the top half of any curve. They're the super athletes, they're the saints, they're the super business people, they're the artists. And what we felt is you can learn certainly more about humanity by studying the very best that humanity is. And most of psychology takes that little normal curve and says, let's look at what's wrong with people all the way down. And goodness knows that's invaluable, but we think this is equally, if not more valuable.
In 1966, one of the methods by which people can access the extraordinary was banned. Not psychedelics were banned not only for the general population, but for research also. And yet research into some of these substances, LSD, psilocybin, and so on, it showed, remarkable things. So why was it banned?
Well, it was a wonderful puzzle for all of us, because the US government stopped all research, about 60 projects, in one day. And these were projects with mice, things that were hardly harming the culture in any way, shape, or form. We were doing psychotherapy research, there was the alcohol research, there was child autism research, which was remarkably successful. There were wonderful things going on. In fact, it was the most researched psychiatric drug in the world at the time that the US government said it has no known medical value and considerable possibilities for abuse.
Now, why would they say that?
Well, well, let us say that they weren't doing what we would call science-based legislation, but they were doing hysteria-based legislation. And there were people who were not accepting of the way the United States was being run. There were many, many people who said, I don't think Vietnam is a very sane way for a country to do things to another country.
Right.
There were people that said treating women as inferior beings is not a healthy or sane way to treat women. There were people who were saying trashing the environment is simply a bad way to work with the environment. Now, the establishment, which represented all those other values, was very naturally upset. And was particularly upset when their children were coming home from college or from the Peace Corps and saying, Dad, Mom, your values don't seem to be really valid for living beings. And that was very upsetting. And so the government said, we've got to do something for all the illegal use, which was already widespread.
Right.
And then someone, and this is my own theory, a little government room full of bureaucrats, and they said, we've got to do something about the scourge of LSD because of what's happening with our children. And someone said, well, we have to stop something. And someone else said, well, we can't stop the illegal work. We're not good as a government in doing that. But we could stop legal research. And someone else said, that's a splendid idea. And so it happened. I can think of no better irrational reason.
Right. So the government put an end to this because they could see that it was against their best interests.
Yeah. And since that time...
But had someone in the government taken it in a therapeutic session,
right,
their ideas might have been different.
Well, there are some...
Unless they were addicted to power and money.
Well, there were some wonderful rumors about Jack Kennedy.
Is it true that he took LSD in the White House?
It's highly likely that he took LSD, all right? Because we know that one of his girlfriends was involved with Tim Leary's group and that it was highly likely. But we really have no real evidence, and there never will be evidence.
Right. But we do know that the last 3 presidents admit to having taken marijuana.
Right. So we know that it's bad for young people to take marijuana, but it's okay for presidents.
Yeah.
So clearly, it's one of those incentives for young people to want to become president.
So what do we do? I mean, come on. We've had 45 years in which research into these very helpful, if properly used, substances. We've had that research which showed that it was really helping people in very basic ways, and then the research was cut off. So what has been done in the past 45 years,
Well,
as far as research goes?
For the past 42 years,
42 years?
nothing.
Okay.
For the past 3 years, quite a lot.
Oh?
Right now, there is a whole renewal of research, and there's research in a few in areas that don't frighten anyone. One is working with terminal cancer patients who have excessive anxiety. And it turns out if you give them psilocybin in, again, a safe, supportive setting, they feel so much better. They are still dying, but they're not wasting the last few months of their lives. They are being able to love their families, they're being able to garden, they're with their grandchildren. They have a very beautiful time till the end of their lives. That's one study. Another study at Johns Hopkins was taking people and giving them people who had a spiritual practice of some sort and saying, here is a substance where there's a lot of literature that says you can have a spiritual experience. And giving it to them, again, safe, supportive setting, and lo and behold, they have a spiritual experience.
What percentage? 70%?
About over 70%, somewhere in that.
78%? Yeah.
Yeah. And therefore, it looks like what we all kind of know to be true from the 60s and from the years in between to be so. But it now is being proved not only scientifically, but it's being proved with full government cooperation. Takes a long time to get all the permissions, but there's a lot of agencies, and they've all signed on for a number of these studies. There's another study with cluster headaches. Cluster headaches are just 10 times worse than the worst migraine.
Right.
People commit suicide rather than have more cluster headaches. And there's very little in the regular medical world that helps them. Well, it turns out, and we don't know why, that a experience with a psychedelic seems to prevent the headaches for months at a time. Now that's extraordinary and of course wonderful. We're also working with another substance, MDMA, ecstasy, with people with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
And again, the conventional medications and even psychotherapy has some effect, but not much. And it turns out that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, meaning inside a kind of therapy time, you get one session with the psychedelic, again, has a massive change for many people, so much so that when they take the kind of test of, what are your symptoms, they no longer have enough post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms to have been allowed to enter the study.
Right. And I understand that with the war in Iraq winding down, we're going to have many, many more of these people coming back.
Approximately 700,000.
Wow. And the Veterans Administration makes it very difficult for these people to get help.
The Veterans Administration is made up of really good people in a system that was not designed for the overload that it currently has.
Right.
And I think we're going to see the veterans, and we are seeing now the first study with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And once that is successful, as it will be, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the Veterans Hospital to allow this to happen. And the other side of it is you have a choice. If you're a bureaucrat and you say, well, here's something that's relatively expensive and takes a couple of months and takes high, expensive personnel. Here's someone who you don't help, and here's 30 years of treatment, medication, as well as social disruption, not paying taxes, homeless, alcoholism, etc. Which one are you going to take? And at some point, we're going to have the kind of sane realization that it's imperative that we help people, even if the way they're being helped doesn't make us comfortable.
Right. 3 years ago, I had a guest on the show. He came back from Iraq, and he got quite emotional about his experiences, and Many people contacted me to say how moved they were by that. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from the woman who was here with him. He murdered somebody. He had a flashback and just offed somebody. He was arrested and then let go. No one knows where he is right now.
Wow.
And so there really is a need for the veterans to be taken care of wisely.
Yeah, and I think we're coming to that. You know, we're coming more and more to the notion that it is immoral not to help someone with a medication if you know the medication can be used correctly. And we're seeing that obviously with medical marijuana in the 16 states for which it is now being used.
Yeah. Now, Dr. Fadiman, I like to ask guests to bring some object or some evocative thing to the show that somehow pertains to what we're talking about. And at first I want to just talk specifically about your book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. It was your idea to, maybe we could do a show on seeking the divine within?
Yes.
So I suspect that this painting you brought has something to do with that. Am I right?
Well, that's my opinion. That's why I brought it.
Right.
You know, when you asked for art, and I looked around, and this happens to be on our mantle.
Your wife did this?
And my wife, Dorothy Fadiman, did this before she became a filmmaker. And her first film was called Radiance, The Experience of Light. Because what happens in psychedelic experiences, in mystical experiences, meditation experiences, is the sense of inner light, as if you are being illuminated from the inside. And in some sense, this painting represents for us the notion that there is this point of light from which the world manifests.
Right.
And also it happens to be, I think, a beautiful painting, which is the main reason I brought it. And I'm being very careful not to tip it over.
I don't want to start the show over again. Okay. Yeah, so that's what it means, huh?
Well, that's what it means to me.
Yeah. When I look at it, I'm reminded of the people I've interviewed about their near-death experiences. You know, they see a point of light somewhere in the darkness, and then they move toward it, and marvelous things happen. And then, depending on how close they get to the light, determines, I think, how much they change when they come back. Some of them are absolutely befuddled by it and don't even want to bother remembering it because it's too disorienting, and it takes them years to assimilate into their personalities. But you know, when you have an experience of inner light, your eyes are closed.
Right.
It happens in your head. It's encased in your skull. How is it possible to experience inner light in the darkness of your head?
Well, what's wonderful is there is an explanation.
Tell me.
Which is right up here. There's your pineal gland. And your pineal gland is light sensitive. Now, it happens to be encased in your skull, but that wasn't true in earlier evolution. If you look at reptiles, for example, their pineal gland
on their head
is still here, but they have just a little skin covering it, and so they actually can feel external light. So we have a light-sensitive organ in the middle of our skull. And we have experiences of people experiencing being flooded with light inside their skull. I think it's lovely that we have an organ there, so we can, as kind of Western scientists say, well, that's a good thing to, you know, that's a nice connection.
But it may be light sensitive, but if it's in your head, where does the light come from?
Well, hold your breath. And maybe we can find out.
Oh, you're not going to tell me?
Well, the wonderful thing about Western science, and even Eastern science in some of these areas, is there are major things we don't know. I mean, the question I'm really asked very often is, what's the biochemical, physiological mechanism of LSD? And I knew when I wrote a book I'd have to deal with that. And so, fortunately, there was this wonderful article which said, here's everything we know. And it said, we've reviewed well over 1,000 articles. We've got a few hundred references in this paper. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna read through this. And then right near the beginning, it said, and we haven't any idea how it works. And I thought, I'm safe. We don't know how it works, but we know that it works. And that seems to be more to the point.
Well, look, you've had many years of experience with this, and you've done a lot of inquiry, and you've come to the point where you don't know, but you must wonder, what's your best guess?
Well, the nice thing is that You know, when people ask those really hard questions, you know, like where does life originate, or is there a God, and you know, those good questions, which are
Right?
I often think that if I looked at a coral reef, you know, 1,000 different species, complicated interactions, so many levels, and I took a parrotfish from that reef and I said, explain to me the ecology of the reef, okay? And the parrotfish looks at me and says, buddy, I'm a parrotfish. How could I understand the complexity of this entire ecological system? And human beings are parrotfish in the way the universe is designed. You know, there's a wonderful book which I recommend about Job.
Oh,
And the book of Job basically says to God, how could you do this to me?
right.
And after a long ways into this book, God says, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? And Job says to himself, you know, I thought I shouldn't have brought the whole thing up. Okay? Because he's doing that argument from authority, which is, I created the whole universe, how are you to question me? And the nice thing is the whole universe has been created, and we get to be in it, and I'm content with that. So I'm really not too excited about theoretical considerations. I love practical results. You know, I love helping alcoholics. I love helping people have a mystical experience. I love protecting people from harm. But I'm not very good at theory.
But your wonder is still
Oh,
at
yeah.
a peak.
Well, it's the same wonder I get when I look at a sunset and I think, I don't know how to do that either.
Yeah. Dr. Fadiman, our time is up, but maybe we can discuss seeking the divine within later on, maybe later on today.
That would be my pleasure.
Okay. Dr. Fadiman, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Those of you who have not had a psychedelic experience, you know, we're not encouraging you to go out and maybe seek one out, but at least we've informed you about what people who have them experience and how they might benefit from it. And research in the future might make these substances more available for use in a wise way that Dr. Fadiman explains in his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. So thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.